This just proves they're on the verge of something special, as Mathew Darche has given an update on his plans for Callum Richie depending on how training camp goes, and this is going to have a lot of Islander fans excited, especially when you compare the way Mathew Darche is talking about this situation to the way Lou Lamoriello would have handled it, which would have been the older player making the lineup just because he has more experience. Now we have a real chance for young players not just to make the Islanders, but to earn their spots on the Islanders, as I think that's really important. A lot of these teams, when they have a ton of prospects, they just kind of force these players in. I love the way Darche is planning to handle Callum Richie. We're going to talk about it more on this episode of Islanders Digest. Really quickly, before we get into this update, our goal is 2,000 subscribers, and we continue to get closer and closer to that goal. Appreciate all of you who have already supported the channel by subscribing. If you haven't already, be sure to do so. And now let's talk about what Mathew Darche has said about Callum Richie. And he said, if Callum Richie comes to training camp and he outplays everyone, I will make room for him on the roster. And as Stefan Rosner points out, on the surface, this is not that big of a general manager quote. This is what you want your general manager to say, that it's a competition, and if you play good enough, well then you earn it. But what I really find interesting about this, first of all, saying that you will make room on the roster. We're going to talk later in this video what that can look like. But I think it's important, one, that players have to earn their spots on the roster. But I actually think it's important that Mathew Darche actually came out and said this, because I think a lot of times young players can be frustrated if it looks like there's no path. And if I was Callum Richie, even though I would be super confident and determined to just do the best I can, it might look a little frustrating to try out for the New York Islanders knowing that they already have 4 centers and really 5 centers down the middle. But hearing this quote that if you earn it, moves will be made so that you can play, it definitely would give me a bit more enthusiasm when it comes to trying out for the team. And it's something I really appreciate Mathew Darche said. He could have said nothing. And this also tells the fans, because I'm sure there are internal conversations with GMs and players and what to expect that we just don't get to see. But for the fans, knowing that this training camp is going to be a true competition, there are scenarios where these young players that we're not really, perhaps not even talking about, perhaps somebody shows up to training camp and just has such a good showing that they deserve a spot on the team. It's good to know that Mathew Darche will adjust and make moves to get that young player the minutes in the NHL that they need. This can get really interesting when it comes to the defense as well, as I'm sure it's the same scenario. We know Schaefer is trying out for this team. Isaiah George is also looking to make the team. There might have to be moves made in order to make room for everyone, and knowing that Mathew Darche is willing to do this is good to know. Now, going into more detail about this article from the Hockey News, there are some more notes on what this can look like, and this article talks again about this idea of Callum Richie playing the wing. This is an idea that I've really gone back and forth on. On one hand, I think it would be really good for him to play wing in the NHL, and initially I was actually supportive of this idea of, hey, it doesn't have to be a center position. However, the more I thought about it, especially looked more at Callum Richie's game, there are some players who can really translate to any position. I'm sure Callum Richie can play wing, but really watching him in the OHL, it seems like one of his best attributes is the way he plays center, the way he's competent defensively, and that's something you're really going to want him to work on in the NHL. As important as it is to get offensive looks on the wing, for Callum Richie to fully develop to his potential, he's also going to need to work on the defensive side of the game, and that's something he's not going to get playing on the wing. It's a completely different position than center, and as a result, I'm a bit colder on that idea of him playing the wing. Sure, maybe for the first few games as the Islanders figure out what to do with Callum Richie, it could work. But for the majority of this season, regardless of where he plays, Callum Richie should be playing center if the Islanders' plan is for him to be a center long term, which I do think that is the plan. Now, this article also mentions that, hey, Casey Ziquez more than Pageau, but Pageau also at times has played wings when needed, so perhaps it's a situation where players can rotate. I find it interesting when it comes to Callum Richie, and I've been a huge part of this. I mean, every other video where I talk about Callum Richie making the NHL, the first name I throw out there, is JG Pageau. And in this video, I'm kind of thinking about different options because, again, one, we've talked about how Pageau's trade value is likely to be highest on the trade deadline, which is true. Although I do think you could trade him right now for solid value, considering the center disaster that is the market of the NHL. You're going to get more for him on the deadline. But also, he's a valuable piece and a player that's going to help make the Islanders better next season. And ideally, you want to find a way to keep as many as your good players, especially Mathew Darche, who's talked about the Islanders making the playoffs. Personally, don't think the Islanders are going to make the playoffs. If I had to guess right now, just based on the roster, I think they can be competitive and better than some people think. But I do think it's a competitive lineup. But again, Mathew Darche has said he wants to make the playoffs, and I definitely think there is a window where the Islanders do make the playoffs. And I think that window is heavily reliant on Pageau having a good year as a third line center or somewhere in this line of Pageau. Taking away Pageau, I think it'd be too many pieces gone from last season, even if Callum Richie does have a big season. The fact is, Callum Richie is going to have growing pains, even if he makes this NHL team right away, and that is going to be okay. And that's the same for Schaefer and things like that. But considering this, I'm really wondering if perhaps when we're talking about a move to get space for Callum Richie, perhaps we're not talking about a Pageau move. Perhaps we're talking about a smaller trade or even just sending another player down to the AHL. It doesn't have to necessarily be this big trade that gets Callum Richie in the lineup. And that's really had me thinking of different ideas and how this can work if Callum Richie earns it. Because truthfully, just looking at the lineup, while I think the Islanders do have a lot of depth forwards, which is going to make this more challenging for the Islanders. For one, I think it's clear that Callum Richie is going to be able to beat out Pierre Engvall. I probably bet that he's a better hockey player than Engvall already at this point. Kyle McLean, same situation. He's going to have no problem beating out guys like that. But those aren't the guys you're going to need to beat out. The guys you have to beat out are the guys who are currently in the lineup. Even look at this. While I do think this will be difficult, I can see Callum Richie potentially beating out an Anthony Duclair or even a Casey Ciziquez. While I don't think guys like Heineman and Siplikov are going to get beat out, you never know what's going to happen. But one thing I'm really thinking about the more I talk about who Callum Richie can beat out, I'm really wondering if perhaps fourth line center might not be the worst idea for his development. And before you say that's a terrible idea and you rip on me in the comments, hear me out. When I was thinking about this, I wasn't thinking about your traditional fourth line. And a big part of this is just looking at this lineup for the Islanders. Siplikov and Heineman, while they are both players who can play physical, these are not your typical fourth line guys. These are both guys known to have a good shot. I guarantee you, even if Casey Ciziquez is the center of this line, Siplikov, Heineman, Ciziquez, or perhaps Callum Richie, that is going to be an above-average scoring fourth line. That's this fourth line that's really going to compete with the third line and even the second line for more minutes. And that really made me think of, because I've been thinking of different teams in the NHL recently, especially during the offseason where I try to get my hockey fix. There just is not enough Islanders news coming out for my liking. I've been looking a bit into the Seattle Kraken and how they've gotten into the mess they are now, where Seattle Kraken are now basically what we feared the Islanders would become if they did not correct their path in the middle of last season when we were talking about being in the middle of nowhere. That's where the Seattle Kraken are. But notably, a few seasons ago, the Seattle Kraken, especially after the draft, had this really interesting scenario where their first line really was not that potent. And the same could go for their second line. But they also had a pretty good fourth line with a couple of young players who really came together and played more minutes than your traditional fourth line. It was almost like a scenario where the Seattle Kraken had 4 different third lines and they were just rolling them out. And that was the year they made the playoffs. And I'm not saying this is a recipe who's going to necessarily get the Islanders to the playoffs, but it's something interesting to consider when it comes to Callum Richie, that perhaps it might be a decent idea to start him as a fourth line center. And then, of course, when there is power play time, especially in the second unit, you give him that time so he continues to develop offensively. But I think that could be a really good balance of helping him get that defensive capability and also making a move that's easier to make. Moving a player like Casey Ciziquez, or even have Casey Ciziquez play as your utility player. At this point in his career, he's shown he can play wing. Honestly, he's not as effective when he plays every single night. Could be a good idea for him to fill in on different lines based on who's injured, stuff like that. I think that's a situation that could really work out well. And of course, in select situations, you could also have Callum Richie play in higher leverage situations. Maybe have him play a shift or two on the wing with Bo Horvat, in addition to playing on the fourth line. I really wonder if perhaps that's a better route for the Islanders to do this rather than committing to a trade of JG Pageau. Because the one thing that I think kind of breaks that idea of the Islanders trading Pageau in the beginning of the season is even if Callum Richie does make the Islanders right off the bat, which I think he can, and the more I watch him play, considering that he made the Avalanche, I find it hard to bet against the fact that he won't make the Islanders next season. But the more I think about it, you got to keep in mind with these younger players, sometimes they take 2 step forwards and then take 1 step back. And as a result, I really can't see Mathew Darche trading JG Pageau just off a sample size of Callum Richie in the preseason. And that's why I'm trying to think of perhaps different ideas that could get him in the lineup. And the wing option is one, but I'm really intrigued about that 4th line center option, where of course he still is playing power play time, getting minutes to play with the top guys to, build up his offensive talent. And I'd love to know what you think about that idea in the comments below. I think it's an interesting idea. I don't necessarily think it is the best option moving forward, but I think it's one that definitely is not getting talked about enough and is more practical than trading JG Pageau off such a small sample size when you're not going to get as much as you could get if you just waited a couple more months. Love to know your thoughts about that in the comments below. As always, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. I'm your host, Patrick Nilan. Catch you on the next episode of Islanders Digest. Let's go, Islanders.